In the Mediterranean theater of the Second World War, the fighting on the Italian peninsula has often been overshadowed by the Normandy campaign or the decisive battles on the Eastern Front. Yet for the Allied High Command at the time, the offensive and defensive operations unfolding in the Lazio region between late 1943 and early 1944 constituted not only a strategic probe, but also a crucial window through which to understand the particular characteristics of Anglo-American and German operations on the peninsula. The so-called Gustav Line was not a single, continuous defensive line. Rather, it was the central axis within a series of depth-based defensive belts constructed by the Germans to exploit the rugged hills and mountainous terrain of Italy. The core defensive strongpoint of this system lay at Monte Cassino and the town of Cassino situated at its foot. The bombing of Monte Cassino Abbey and the four major offensives that followed not only consumed vast Allied manpower and materiel, but also sparked enduring debates and controversy over the decision-making behind the operation. During this protracted stalemate, the interactions among soldiers and commanders from multiple nations, the contradictions between differing strategic assessments, and the competing interpretations of terrain and intelligence all gradually shaped the trajectory of the campaign. These developments can only be fully understood when situated within the broader strategic context of the Allied operations in Italy after the 1943 landings. Following the successful landings in Sicily in July 1943, the Allies achieved a significant degree of initiative on the Italian front. The collapse of the Mussolini regime and the subsequent surrender of the Badoglio government produced a political implosion within the Axis position in Italy, yet this did not lead to a rapid military disintegration of German forces. Under the overall direction of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, German forces adopted a strategy designed to delay the Allied northward advance. Kesselring quickly recognized that Italy's southern mountainous terrain, narrow valleys, and limited road network constituted a natural defensive barrier. By constructing carefully engineered defensive systems, he sought to draw out the Allied advance through the peninsula, forcing them to expend large quantities of resources in Italy rather than opening a new front in France. This strategic intention aligned closely with Hitler's orders to defend every inch of territory. Thus, beginning in the winter of 1943, the Germans devoted their principal efforts to fortifying a series of meticulously reconnoitered defensive lines, of which the most critical was the Gustav Line stretching across central Italy. The Gustav Line consisted of a series of fortified positions, strong points, bunkers, trenches, and concealed fire sites, running across the Apennines. Its western sector used the Rapido River as a natural obstacle, its central anchor was Monte Cassino, and its eastern extension reached the Sangro River defenses on the Adriatic coast. By late 1943, following the Allies' grueling advance through southern Italy, the liberation of Naples, and the seizure of the Foggia Plain, the main Allied formations had concentrated in central Italy. They hoped to break through the German defenses with a renewed offensive once winter ended. Yet the Italian winter proved severe. Heavy rains and even snowfall created atrocious mountain war conditions that severely limited the effectiveness of Allied mechanized forces. Meanwhile, the Germans, taking advantage of their familiarity with the terrain, placed layered fire coverage on the high ground surrounding Cassino, making any movement along major roads extraordinarily hazardous. Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark, commanding the U.S. Fifth Army, was forced to devise a breakthrough plan under extremely unfavorable conditions of weather and terrain. Clark's forces included American and British troops, as well as units from New Zealand, India, French North Africa, Poland, and others. Nevertheless, his order of battle still needed to coordinate closely with the British Eighth Army operating on the Adriatic flank. Both Clark and General Sir Harold Alexander, the Allied commander-in-chief in the Mediterranean, hoped to break the Gustav Line before the spring of 1944. This objective carried not only tactical implications, but also political and strategic ones. With American domestic pressure mounting for the opening of a second front in Europe, the Allied leadership urgently needed to tie down as many German forces as possible before the planned landings in France, to prevent the Germans from concentrating their full defensive strength against the future Normandy invasion. Therefore, drawing German forces into the Italian theater became a key strategic requirement. Breaking the Gustav Line appeared to be the most direct means of accomplishing this. However, from late 1943 through early 1944, Clark's Fifth Army encountered far greater resistance around Cassino than anticipated. Bitter cold, deep mud, sudden snowstorms, and the Germans' comprehensive fire control over roads and valleys turned every attempt to cross rivers, climb slopes, or enter the town of Cassino into a costly ordeal. The first major attempt to break through along the Rapido River by the U.S. 36th Infantry Division in January 1944 ended in disaster. Major General Fred L. Walker, commanding the division, repeatedly expressed his dissatisfaction afterward, arguing that the river crossing operation had been attempted without adequate intelligence and at the wrong moment. The 36th Division was pinned down by German fire along the riverbanks within hours. Engineers attempting to build footbridges came under sustained machine gun and mortar fire, leaving several infantry companies isolated and ultimately suffering severe casualties. The failure demonstrated that attempting a direct breakthrough along the main approach to Cassino was nearly impossible, at least under such adverse conditions of terrain, weather, and insufficient coordination. After this first setback, the Allied High Command turned its attention toward Monte Cassino itself. The monastery atop the mountain, founded in AD 529, had endured several cycles of destruction and reconstruction and was regarded as the symbolic birthplace of Western monasticism under the Benedictine order. From late 1943 into early 1944, the abbey became the most conspicuous landmark at the center of the battlefront. Although the monastery was unoccupied by German troops before fighting escalated, and although the Germans deliberately avoided placing military assets inside it to avoid provoking local civilians and international opinion, the Allied frontline units observed that its commanding height offered unparalleled visibility over the valleys and road networks below. Thus, in the assessment of many frontline commanders and staff officers, the abbey could potentially serve as a critical German observation and fire control point. Although firm evidence of this remained elusive, a large number of reports from soldiers and junior officers raised suspicions about possible German activity around the abbey. The question of whether the monastery had become an observation post became a subject of intense debate within the Allied command. The U.S. Fifth Army headquarters and the staff of the New Zealand 2nd Division both displayed varying degrees of hesitation. Numerous staff officers, including several British officers, questioned the necessity of bombing the monastery, arguing that the intelligence remained inconclusive and that the destruction of such a major cultural landmark would bring severe consequences. Those advocating bombardment, however, argued that as long as the abbey remained intact, it posed a potential threat to any ground operation, and its symbolic significance made it even more likely that the Germans would exploit its topographical advantage. By February 1944, as the stalemate deepened, internal Allied debates over bombing the abbey grew increasingly heated. Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, commanding the New Zealand 2nd Division, was firmly convinced that the monastery had to be destroyed. Otherwise, any assault on Monte Cassino would be jeopardized. Freyberg's judgment has been widely discussed by later historians, many of whom argue that his decisions were shaped by the intense battlefield pressure and a heavy reliance on frontline reports of suspicious activity, despite the lack of verified intelligence. Several British and New Zealand staff officers later recalled that Freyberg insisted that regardless of whether German troops were currently inside the abbey, the building offered a possible observational advantage and, from a tactical standpoint, should not be allowed to remain. The British side, particularly some officers within Alexander's headquarters, expressed reservations in various meetings. Alexander himself, in his correspondence and planning documents, noted his ethical concerns about destroying a cultural treasure and worried about political backlash from the Italian government and the Vatican. Ultimately, the decision to bomb the monastery was pushed toward irreversibility under the weight of multiple pressures. The most direct pressure came from the operational situation. Repeated Allied assaults had failed, casualties were mounting, the winter weather remained punishing, and the German line showed no signs of weakening. Under these circumstances, Clark and Freyberg both hoped that a large-scale air attack might create the conditions necessary for a successful ground assault. Although the Allied intelligence community and several officers continued to express doubts, the prolonged stalemate gradually increased the desire among frontline commanders to eliminate the abbey's observational potential. Between February 14 and 15, 1944, the decision was finalized. The bombing was scheduled for the morning of February 15 and was to be carried out by U.S. heavy bombers. On the morning of February 15, 1944, dozens of U.S. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-25 medium bombers took off under clear weather and flew toward Cassino. The bombing began around 9 a.m. and continued into the early afternoon. The monastery was completely destroyed during the sustained bombardment. Its massive stone walls collapsed under the impact of high explosive and incendiary bombs, and the 1,000-year-old abbey was reduced to rubble. Most monks and civilians who had taken refuge inside had been permitted to evacuate beforehand to nearby safe locations, though some were killed in the attack due to confusion or delays in movement. In the hours following the bombardment, the scene of ruins and billowing dust was impossible for either Allied or German soldiers to ignore. Yet events did not unfold as the Allies had hoped. Prior to the bombing, no German military personnel had occupied the monastery, and the German command had adhered to strict orders to maintain its non-militarized status. After the bombing, however, the situation changed dramatically. Once reduced to rubble, the shattered walls and dense piles of stone provided the Germans with an almost ideal defensive strongpoint. Within hours of the attack, units of the German 1st Parachute Division moved into the ruins and rapidly transformed them into a formidable defensive position. Major General Richard Heydrich, the division's commander, later noted in operational records that the rubble offered defensive advantages superior to the original intact monastery. The ruins scattered fire positions, created natural cover, and made it extremely difficult for the Allies to employ direct fire to suppress the defenders. Paradoxically, the bombing created a far stronger German defensive position, an outcome the Allies had entirely failed to anticipate. The ground assault that followed was led primarily by New Zealand and Indian forces, but it too encountered fierce resistance. The New Zealand 2nd Division and the Indian 4th Division attempted to advance along the slopes and toward the Abbey ruins, but were met with unyielding defense from the German paratroopers. In the rugged terrain of Monte Cassino, every upward movement exposed Allied infantry to snipers, machine gun nests, mortars, and mountain artillery. The dense stones, collapsed columns, and broken walls of the ruins created a maze-like environment that disoriented attackers, while German mortar crews exploited hidden angles to suppress Allied advances. As the assault stalled, the Allied command began to reconsider the coordination of bombardment and infantry action. Yet larger strategic imperatives, especially the need to draw more German forces into Italy to relieve pressure on the future Normandy landings, meant the offensive had to continue. After the failure of the Second Offensive, Allied operations in the Cassino sector once again sank into a prolonged stalemate. Although the ruins of Monte Cassino no longer retained the architectural form of the ancient monastic complex, they had become one of the most formidable strongpoints available to the defenders. The German 1st Parachute Division constructed an intricate web of interlocking fields of fire throughout the rubble, concealing machine gun nests, sniper positions, and mortar pits behind collapsed stone walls. Every Allied attempt to advance demanded extremely heavy casualties. In the reports of frontline units, soldiers described the ruins as a breathing fortress that spat fire from unseen angles at any moment. Following the end of the second assault, Field Marshal Harold Alexander and General Mark Clark were compelled to reassess the strategic posture of the entire sector. Although they faced pressure from political authorities, strategic planners, and the Anglo-American Combined Chiefs of Staff, who hoped the Italian front would continue drawing German resources, the multiple failures at Cassino made achieving that objective increasingly complex. Disputes over operational planning intensified within the Allied command, particularly regarding topographical intelligence, the effectiveness of artillery support, and the coordination of ground forces. Agreement between British and American leadership proved difficult. Clark wished to press forward, confident that numerical and firepower superiority could eventually break the line. Yet he also had to acknowledge that the German mountain defense system was far more resilient than previously estimated. At the beginning of March 1944, severe weather continued to restrict Allied operations. Weeks of continuous rain caused the river valleys to overflow, turning the town of Cassino into a swamp of mud-filled ruins. The rocks along the slopes of the mountain, washed smooth by the downpour, became dangerously slick. Allied mechanized forces could no longer maneuver effectively. Armored units frequently found themselves immobilized at the foot of the mountain or stuck on narrow approach roads, where they became ideal targets for German artillery. Even Allied fire support struggled to achieve effectiveness. Many German defensive positions were buried deep in rock crevices, while the echo and refraction of sound in the mountains made artillery spotting and adjustment exceedingly difficult. British and New Zealand staff officers noted repeatedly in their reports that Cassino was one of the worst battlefields imaginable for artillery observation and fire direction. It was under these conditions that preparations for the Third Allied Offensive began. Once again, the New Zealand 2nd Division would constitute the main striking force, while the Indian 4th Division attempted a wide flanking movement through the mountain ridges to the east, hoping to envelop the German defenses. The New Zealanders had already suffered catastrophic losses in previous engagements. They had bled heavily in the streets, riverbeds, and slopes around Cassino. Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, commander of the 2nd New Zealand Division, repeatedly pressed the Allied command for increased support. He argued that without overwhelming artillery and air suppression, the infantry would once again be slaughtered as they approached the German paratroopers' defensive perimeter. As a result, the Allies planned a massive air and artillery bombardment prior to the launch of the third assault in an effort to weaken the defenders' positions and suppress their firing points. However, the air raid launched on March 15 revealed once more the persistent problems with air-ground coordination. At dawn, waves of Allied aircraft bombed the town of Cassino and its surrounding areas. Unlike the earlier bombing of the monastery, this attack targeted the town itself along with any German defensive positions concealed in the streets. Throughout the morning, Allied air forces dropped hundreds of tons of bombs, leveling the entire town. In theory, transforming the urban terrain into rubble was supposed to hamper the Germans' ability to organize effective resistance. Yet, as had occurred with the destruction of the monastery, the devastation inadvertently created new cover, firing slits, and hideouts for the paratroopers. Furthermore, the massive craters, rubble fields, and unexploded ordnance turned the approach routes into chaotic obstacle courses, severely hindering the infantry's advance. Once the third offensive commenced, New Zealand and Indian forces advanced from multiple directions, but progress remained painfully slow. Although German paratroopers were subjected to a degree of suppression, their defense of the rubble turned the fighting into a grueling, room-to-room struggle. Many buildings had lost their outer walls, but their remaining interior structures formed labyrinthine defensive nodes. German snipers concealed themselves in half-collapsed houses, firing upon any exposed movement. As the Indian 4th Division ascended the slopes, its troops became ever more vulnerable to mortar fire from German positions higher up the mountain. Several Indian officers wrote in their reports that the troops could not find a safe route, not an inch of the mountainside was shielded from enemy observation. Moreover, the third offensive exposed deeper problems in cooperation within the Anglo-American command structure. Some American commanders believed the New Zealand troops lacked adequate shock power, whereas New Zealand officers criticized American units for failing to provide sufficient flank support. Both sides later acknowledged in their records that language barriers, differences in operational doctrine, and conflicting interpretations of the Cassino battlefield hindered coordination. The Germans, by contrast, displayed remarkable tactical discipline in integrating their paratroopers with mountain units. They conducted frequent small unit counterattacks, preventing the Allies from consolidating the limited ground they managed to take. As the offensive dragged on, casualty numbers soared. Many companies lost 1/3 to half of their personnel within days, while replacements could not reach the front quickly enough. The terrain complicated all lines of communication and supply. Stretcher bearers attempting to evacuate the wounded up or down the slopes risked machine gun bursts and rock slides with nearly every movement. At the same time, local Italian civilians endured severe hardships. Although many had fled prior to the combat, others, delayed by blocked roads or poor communication, remained trapped near the front lines. Bombing and artillery fire devastated their homes, rendering thousands homeless. After the monastery was destroyed, the monks of Monte Cassino dispersed to various shelters as they tried to preserve whatever manuscripts and relics had survived the bombardment. After several days of fierce combat, the third assault yielded minimal gains. The Allies were forced to suspend the offensive in early April. The Gustav Line remained unbroken, and the German paratroopers still held the core defensive positions with iron resolve. Allied commanders had little choice but to acknowledge that frontal assaults supported solely by artillery and air power could not defeat the German mountain defense system. Field Marshal Alexander therefore resolved to redesign the overall operational plan, shifting from direct assaults on Cassino to a broader strategy of envelopment and coordinated breakthroughs. This reorientation would lead to the fourth and final major offensive of the Cassino campaign, the largest, best prepared, and ultimately decisive operation that would break the Gustav Line. In this phase, the Allies would assemble a multinational force including the Polish II Corps and the French Expeditionary Corps. Through a combination of mountain flank attacks and a renewed offensive from the Anzio beachhead, the Allies would finally force the Germans to withdraw from the Cassino stronghold. Following the failure of the third offensive, the Cassino campaign entered a brief but critically important pause. By April 1944, Allied senior commanders recognized that frontal assaults alone could not breach the Gustav Line in the short term, nor could they sustain the mounting casualties. The staff of Field Marshal Harold Alexander began to shift their focus from the central area of Cassino town to the broader terrain, seeking a more flexible combination of strategies to identify a breakthrough point. At this stage, the Allies had key operational areas both to the north and south of the Italian peninsula. To the north, the Anzio beachhead, which had remained encircled by German forces since the January 1944 landings, to the south, Cassino and the extended Gustav Line. Coordinating operations across these two theaters to achieve a combined breakthrough became a critical challenge for Alexander and his subordinate commanders. During this period, Alexander decided to implement a more systematic operational plan. He designated the forthcoming offensive as Operation Diadem. The plan aimed to employ a multinational force to break through the Gustav Line, advance rapidly northward, and link up with the forces at Anzio, thereby encircling and annihilating the German main force south of Rome. Compared to the previous three offensives, Operation Diadem was not only larger in scale and more thoroughly prepared but also more sophisticated in troop deployment and firepower coordination. Alexander's plan distributed forces, including the Polish II Corps, New Zealand and Indian troops, US and British units, and the French Expeditionary Corps, according to terrain and operational expertise. Staff officers concluded that the French Expeditionary Corps, with its extensive experience in North African mountain warfare, was best suited for the critical task of breaking through the Urency Mountains. The Polish II Corps, meanwhile, due to its strong political motivation and disciplined structure, was deemed the optimal force to assault the ruins of Monte Cassino Abbey. Beyond military deployments, Alexander faced the difficult task of coordinating command among Allied forces. Previous operations had exposed significant tensions between American and British/Commonwealth forces over operational doctrine, coordination methods, and strategic priorities. For instance, General Mark Clark favored rapid advances and minimal reliance on complex multinational coordination, whereas British officers emphasized systematic planning and synchronized operations. To reduce friction, Alexander adopted a more centralized and unified command structure. In Operation Diadem, corps-level advance axes were clearly delineated, and staff officers provided explicit instructions to ensure synchronized execution of the offensive. On the German side, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring remained alert to the possibility of Allied action but underestimated the scale of a potential simultaneous, multi-directional assault. In the spring of 1944, Kesselring still believed the Allies would continue limited frontal attacks around Cassino town and would not attempt a large-scale breakthrough along the mountain flanks. This assessment was partially informed by the experience of prior offensives, in which Allied mountain operations had repeatedly failed. Consequently, German defensive emphasis remained concentrated on the ruins of the Monte Cassino Abbey and its immediate surroundings. However, in the southernmost sectors of the Gustav Line near the Urency Mountains, German defenses were relatively thin. Kesselring's staff did not anticipate that the French Expeditionary Corps could launch a large-scale assault through seemingly impassable mountain terrain, nor did they foresee that the North African Moroccan mountain troops could traverse these ridges so rapidly. German intelligence underestimated the mobility of the colonial mountain units, providing the Allies with a significant strategic opportunity. In the weeks preceding the operation, Allied staff carried out meticulous preparations. Mortar support plans were drafted, armor was redeployed, and large numbers of engineers were assigned to construct bridges and clear obstacles. Additional supply ships were mobilized along the Mediterranean coast to ensure sustained logistical support once the offensive began. Air forces also adjusted their missions, planning concentrated bombardments before the assault to disrupt German supply and reinforcement routes to Cassino. The Allies' logistics system showcased the advantages of industrialized warfare at this stage. Massive U.S. materiel flowed through the port of Naples, while British and Canadian transport units supplied the 8th Army along the Adriatic. Though costly, these preparations ensured that Operation Diadem would enjoy robust logistical support throughout its execution. Within the attacking forces, the Polish II Corps under Lieutenant General Władysław Anders attracted particular attention. The participation of the Polish forces carried not only military significance but also profound political symbolism. Since the 1939 invasions of Poland by Germany and the Soviet Union, the exiled Polish government had sought to maintain an independent army on the European front, aiming to secure political leverage in post-war negotiations. Anders himself had been released from a Soviet labor camp and assembled the corps from troops who had endured exile, forced labor, or the devastation of their homes. They viewed the battle for Monte Cassino as a campaign of national revenge, demonstrating exceptional morale and fighting spirit. On the eve of the offensive, Anders declared, "We will take this mountain, whatever the cost." This statement became part of the enduring Polish collective memory. Operation Diadem officially commenced on the night of May 11, 1944. Across the front, from the Adriatic to the Lazio region, The roar of Allied artillery announced the start of the attack. The British 8th Army and the US 5th Army launched simultaneous advances, while the French Expeditionary Corps struck from the southern flank through the Ourense Mountains, and the Polish II Corps prepared for a decisive assault on the summit of Monte Cassino. That night, more than 1,600 artillery pieces opened fire, one of the largest preparatory bombardments in the Italian theater. German forward positions were shattered, and despite the paratroopers' experience and dispersed defensive tactics, they were forced to retreat at several key points. The French Expeditionary Corps displayed remarkable mountain warfare capabilities during the advance. The Moroccan mountain units, in particular, scaled nearly vertical ridgelines under cover of darkness, breaching the Ourense Mountains at a speed that completely surprised the Germans. In numerous post-war German accounts, officers repeatedly noted that the mountain troops seemed to defy the natural laws of terrain, capturing ridges deemed impassable within hours. This breakthrough created a serious gap in the southern end of the Gustav Line, forcing the Germans to commit reserve forces. Kesselring recognized the potential threat to the entire line but faced severe constraints due to pressure along multiple sectors and stretched logistics. Simultaneously, the Polish II Corps advanced along the flanks of Monte Cassino. Ander's plan divided his forces into two main routes from the east and north, aiming to seize the key high point of Monte Calvario and the connecting ridges to the abbey. The German 1st Parachute Division had deployed elite paratroopers in this area, with well-positioned fire that covered extensive arcs. Polish troops encountered intense resistance during night climbs, the slopes were steep, rocks loose, and German machine gun positions continuously raked their advance. The battle often descended into brutal close-quarters combat, with repeated struggles for single rocks or crumbled walls, resulting in heavy casualties. Within the first 48 hours, the Polish II Corps suffered thousands of casualties but gradually captured critical high ground, setting the stage for a final assault on the abbey ruins. For several days, the front remained the scene of high-intensity combat. The French breakthrough forced the Germans to reduce troop allocations along the midline, while the Polish advance compelled the paratroopers to withdraw gradually toward the abbey ruins. By May 17, the Polish II Corps had finally breached the ridgeline defenses around Monte Calvario, opening a gap in the last German lines surrounding the abbey. The paratroopers, while still maintaining disciplined defense, could no longer hold the entire high ground. That night, the German command ordered the evacuation of the abbey ruins to avoid encirclement. On the morning of May 18, 1944, reconnaissance units of the Polish II Corps raised the Polish flag over the ruins of Monte Cassino Abbey. The ruins finally fell into Allied hands, marking the conclusion of months of continuous fighting at Cassino. Post-war figures indicate that the Polish II Corps suffered more than 4,000 casualties, many of whom were buried anonymously on the slopes. The Polish military cemetery at the foot of Monte Cassino remains a tangible testament to this history. The collapse of the Gustav Line opened the road to Rome. German forces were forced to retreat northward, while Allied troops at Anzio advanced inland to link with the southern forces. Rome was liberated on June 4. Nonetheless, Kesselring successfully orchestrated an orderly withdrawal, regrouping his forces along the Trasimene and Gothic lines, and continued to resist in northern Italy until the spring of 1945. Thus, while the Cassino campaign achieved a significant operational victory, it did not result in the complete destruction of German forces or a rapid end to the Italian campaign. Nevertheless, the Allied victory at Monte Cassino had profound strategic implications. It tied down a significant portion of German forces, alleviating pressure on the Western Front ahead of the Normandy landings, and demonstrated the Allies' capacity to conduct complex multinational coordination, mountain warfare, and protracted assault operations. Politically and diplomatically, the performance of the Polish II Corps enhanced the legitimacy of the Polish government in exile, even if post-war realities did not yield the independence for which they had fought. The bombing and destruction of Monte Cassino Abbey remained a subject of prolonged post-war controversy. Many historians argue that the decision lacked sufficient intelligence support and did not confer tangible tactical advantage. Instead, it caused immense cultural loss and inadvertently strengthened German defensive positions within the ruins. Others emphasize that given the intelligence available and battlefield pressures at the time, the commanders faced a profoundly difficult choice, with far greater complexity than post-war critics could fully appreciate. The abbey was eventually rebuilt to its original appearance and structure, preserving its historical and spiritual symbolism. Yet the destruction left a lasting imprint on local society and religious tradition. Efforts to restore cultural artifacts involved multiple organizations, but many artworks and documents were permanently lost. As one of the most grueling mountain assault campaigns of World War II, the Battle of Monte Cassino exemplifies the brutality and complexity of war, as well as the challenges of multinational coordination under extreme conditions. The stalemate along the Gustav Line, the controversial bombing of the abbey, the mountain breakthroughs of the French Expeditionary Corps, the sacrifices of the Polish II Corps, and the ultimate Allied victory together constitute a history replete with contradictions, tragedy, and strategic significance. It was not a battle of singular meaning, but a vast and interwoven tableau of warfare, reflecting strategic decisions, intelligence miscalculations, cultural preservation dilemmas, national political aspirations, and the limits of human endurance under fire.